Assalamu alaikum. I'm Dr. Khalid Al-Habib, Professor of Cardiology at King Saud University, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Today is my great pleasure to chair this session of the Virtual Research Academy under the Saudi Heart Association. A great pleasure and honor to have our second speaker today, Dr. Adel Gnaibet, Chief Officer at Public Health Intelligence at the Public Health Authority, PHA, in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. She's also the agency's lead epidemiologist and one of the focal persons on public health and data science. Dr. Ada is currently leading the PHA's work on premature mortality and longevity, and one of the key persons in its work program on non-communicable diseases. Prior to her position at the PHA, Ada had the work program of the Population Health Department and National Saudi Bank at King Abdullah International Medical Research Center in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where she had led redesign of the national biobank study, applying international standards to increase data quality and to expand the catchment area, leading to increased participation. Dr. Ada has been key in designing and launching several large-scale epidemiological studies in Saudi Arabia, and her research interests focus on cardiovascular diseases and its risk factors. Dr. Ada's academic background includes a Bachelor in Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery MBBS from King Saud University, a Master of Medical Education from King Saud bin Abdulaziz University for Health Sciences, and a PhD in Epidemiology from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, USA. So very rich CV, and really a great pleasure and honor to have Dr. Ada with us, an expert in the area. Without further ado, it's a great pleasure to have you, Dr. Ada. The mic is yours, and the title of your talk is Epidemiology Basic Concepts. The main vision and mission behind these kind of virtual activities is to enhance the research culture in our community by starting with these basic concepts, and hopefully with time we'll start to go into more advanced concepts as we go through. Mic is yours, Dr. Ada.
Thank you, Professor Khalid, for this invite. It's a pleasure. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending, and I do hope that we are able to cover the basic concepts of epidemiology. I will just share my screen with you. First of all, it's always challenging to do a presentation virtually. So I do hope I do not lose your attention. It's a quite rich lecture. However, hopefully I can give you kind of a view of EPI from 10,000 feet above, to have you just think, whenever you look at a research question, in what way or path should you walk. So Prof. Khalid, thank you for the intro. This is my background. Started as a physician, kind of changed paths and ended in epidemiology. Just to all my healthcare providers, I think that switch for me, and I believe I was told that it's not easy for clinicians to think or put the hat of the epidemiologist. So just bear with me, and hopefully this can help you out when it comes to thinking about research questions and applying epidemiology to your research question. What we're going to go over is just a slide or two on what epidemiology is. I think in the past 2 years with this pandemic, we've heard a lot about epi from not necessarily epidemiologists, and I think I'm just trying to discern what this science entails is quite relevant. A slide or two about hypothesis testing, just because you're laying out the land. So if you don't have your blueprint, which is your hypothesis, that's where you begin. Then you kind of things get confused. And then just an overview of the 3 main steps we look at when we analyze any data. And I cannot emphasize enough that we need to go into all these 3 steps. I'll try to stop in between just to kind of in a slide, interim slide, hopefully if you lost your focus with me, hopefully I can get it back. And then at the end, Prof. Khalid will moderate the questions regarding this lecture. So hopefully none of you are in bed. I think that does not induce focus, especially with a kind of complex or intense lecture. So I hope I can maintain your focus with me today. If I want to start with what epi is, in general, it's defined as the study of distribution and determinant of disease frequency, or the study of the occurrence of illness. So if we look at this one, this slide, see in the middle, you have who, what's the data type, what are we testing, and then what's the type of action. On the left side of your screen, you see the patient is who, and then the data type is vertical data, so kind of a line. You're looking into the beginning and the end of that data line. You're testing a diagnosis of a patient, and then you're treating that patient. To your right, you're actually looking at a whole population, not one patient. The data is not only in a linear fashion, it's both linear and vertical and horizontal. You're not testing a diagnosis, you're testing a hypothesis. What does it lead to? It leads us to intervene or prevent certain diseases. Now, I think that's clear from what you see here is that on the left-hand side, this is how the healthcare provider thinks and how the healthcare provider operates. Whereas on your right side, that's how an epidemiologist thinks and operates. And so just kind of gauging how the difference between the two paths, there's a commonality, yes, but there's a difference of how we actually think. Now, if you look at this, I think the first time I heard of epidemiology was on a sitcom show, and I did not know what it was at that time. So what people think about our profession, you can see on the right, on the left, a misconception of what epidemiologist is. In the middle, what we think we do, and then and you can see on the right, what some friends think we don't have much to do. And then at finally, which is the left lower right hand of your screen, this is the majority of our work where we actually work on examining associations, proving them or disproving them. Now, if you go into hypothesis testing, that's how you start with your research question. And that's a very important start point to look at. And so when you look at a hypothesis, all of them start by stating, all statistical questions start by a hypothesis. Usually we have the two types I'm sure you're familiar with, the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis is just saying that what we're trying to prove, so any observed difference in a sample does not exist. It's just only due to chance. So there's no true association between what we're trying to look at. Whereas our alternative hypothesis is that there is an effect, there is an association. So we're saying that that the assumption of no difference is wrong or it is not, and we reject it and we accept our alternative hypothesis. Of course, that means in most cases we are trying to prove the alternative hypothesis. However, what I would like you to focus on and hopefully not be discouraged is that even if you disprove an alternative hypothesis, that's science. That's also reaching to examining an association, saying it does not exist, and therefore we move on to examine other associations. Now, if we look at analysis strategy, sometimes people kind of get very energized and they would like to jump to the final step, which is the modeling step that we call an epi. Again, that's the final process. It's just like jumping, when you look at a patient, jumping from looking at the patient to diagnosing the patient, to treating the patient. So unless you take a thorough history, a thorough examination, conduct the test as needed, and then you have your differential diagnosis, and then you have your treatment, then you will have the wrong diagnosis and thus the wrong treatment. So always try to think of it this way. You need to start with your univariate analysis, followed by the bivariate analysis, and then finally the multivariate analysis. When we look at the three different steps, now again, because we're just talking about the basic concepts, I'm not going to go into detail. That will take lectures and lectures to cover all these concepts, but just I would like you to think or have an overview of what these different steps entail. And so when you start your research, you have kind of an understanding of what you expect to do in each of these steps. So if you start with a univariate analysis, that's looking at your different variables within your data set. So if you have a study that examines cardiovascular diseases and you, let's say, collected 20 variables on 1,000 participants, then the initial step is looking at each and every variable of these 20 variables for 1,000 N population. It's the simplest form of analysis. It describes the different patterns of each variable and includes measures of central tendency and dispersion. Now, I show here, I underline an essential step. This, I cannot emphasize enough that this is a very important step, because unless you look at these variables individually, then all the other conclusions and inferences you make may be incorrect. So if you have outliers, if you have nonsensical data in, if you have missing data in, you don't attend to it, then your modeling, which is your final step, will be built on falsehoods or biases. So you really need to look into your data. You need to understand how your data looks like before you go forward. So what does that mean? As I mentioned, you want to see how much missing observations are, what type of missing observations is there? Is there coding errors? As I said, are there outliers? Are there extreme variables? Let's say if you have age, you have suddenly age that's 200 years. So if you don't actually look at that, then that 200 will be accounted for when you look at the mean age, which means it will skew your age in that study. And that applies to all different variables. And then you also want to look at the shape of data, which means you're going to use different graphs depending on the type of the variable to look at how the data is behaving. So how is it shaped? And then is it normally distributed? And as you know, the normal distribution, what we kind of say is your bell curve shape. And you want to see in that, where is your outliers? If you're using different, you can use different graphing techniques or methodologies to show you that. And that will, knowing how your data is and what are the type of variables you have, then that guides you on what are the most suitable statistical tests. Because if the data is normal, we have a different path for modeling. If the data is non-normal data, then we have a different path of modeling as well. If we have a lot of missing data, the way we model is affected accordingly. Now, this is just one slide to show you the different types of graphs that can be used depending on the type of data you have and the type of variables you have. You have histograms, bar charts, box plots, and pie charts. These are just examples or other graphing techniques that you have, just to kind of open your eyes on what you can, how you can graph your data to better understand how your data looks like. Okay, so again, about data, and I think we're still in a developing country when it comes to research, so I cannot emphasize this also enough. So this is just a joke. I don't have any accurate numbers, so I just made up this one. Studies have shown that accurate numbers aren't any more useful than ones you make. How many studies showed that? 87. So just again, to keep in mind that the validity of your data is what the strength of studies are based on. It's what the science is based on. The weaker the data, the weaker the science, and therefore it affects how we treat patients and what are the interventions that are more valuable and more effective. Now, moving on to descriptive statistics, there's two different types we commonly call measure of central tendency and then measures of dispersion. And that kind of may be self-explanatory. The central tendency is where is the data at when it comes to its mean, its mode, and median. And these are the different estimates for central tendency. When we talk about measures of dispersion, we look at the range, the percentile, interquartile range, variance, and standard deviation. I'm not going to be talking about all of these extensively because I'm sure you know most of them. I'll just comment on one specific maybe notes or things to bear in mind when we look at these different measures. Now, when we look at central tendency, what is it? It's the statistical measure that identifies a single value as representative of an entire distribution. So you're taking one variable, which is your mean, mode, or median, and saying that's our representative variable of this distribution. Now, when we look at the different types of central tendency, what we want to focus on here, if you can see, is how your data is performing. On the left, when we see a symmetrical distribution, what does that mean? That means our mean, mode, and median are actually on top of each other. So this is your normally distributed. That means they're the same. That means the kind of data is in our world is acting perfectly. You can see when it's positively skewed and negatively skewed, how the data looks differently, and how does the median, mean, and mode are not the same, and how do they change to the left or right depending on the skewness. Now, if we move to the measures of dispersion, I'm only going to talk about the standard deviation. I'm sure you know of these different types of dispersion. Standard deviation is the most important one of these. It's the one that commonly you look at when you're looking at your data. It is also, but before we go in that, what does that mean? It means how much variation exists in your data. Are they closely clustered around the measure of central tendency, which we're talking about our mean, median, and mode, or are they not? Of course, this cannot be used for nominal data because if you remember how that curve looked like, these are continuous data and not nominal. And so ideally, you want minimal variation in your data. So the less variation, the smaller the standard deviation, the more accurate the data looks. So just a few words about standard deviation for us. I know in statistics or commonly in research, you've heard the term of p-value, statistically significant, and how we highly focus on if it's above or below 0.05. I would urge you when you look into your data and look into your modeling, not only to look at your p-value, but also to pay attention to your standard deviation and whether that standard deviation is wide or narrow, and whether that standard deviation in, let's say, when we're talking about logistic regression, does it include the null value or not? So it's one of the most, or it is the most important measure of variation. It is the square root of your variance, and it's the unit of it is the same unit of your variable that you're looking at. So for example, if we're looking at standard deviation for age, the unit is years. However, the variance unit is not in years. And then, as I said, the smaller the standard deviation, the less the variance in your data, which means the better the data looks like. And if we're referring to the standard deviation of a model, the output of that model, that means it's likely to be statistically significant. Okay, so that we covered the univariate analysis. As I said, just remember you need to examine thoroughly how your data looks like. If you have missing variables, how much they're missing, if you have outliers, if you have issues with coding, and how your data is behaving, whether it is normal or non-normal. We'll now move to bivariate analysis. So we looked at each variable on its own. Now we look at the variables in twos. So what gives the people feeling of power? I think maybe in the period of the pandemic, there's an uprise of the stock of epidemiologists and epidemiology. So apparently it says that it does give you status. Not sure about that. We haven't felt that yet, but that's what it says. Okay, so looking at bivariate analysis, we'll focus on as we said, we look at two variables. So if we take an exposure, and I'm going to use these two terms repeatedly, so if you can just focus on that part. So when I talk about an independent variable, that's my X, or that's my exposure, which is the variable does not change. If I look at the dependent variable, it's my outcome, or it's my Y variable. And so here we're looking at two variables together. How do they look alike together? What is the association or the shape or the type of relationship between two variables? I don't want to scare you with this slide, but for me, there's two slides here, the bivariate and the multivariate analysis slide. As you see on the right, I refer to the professor who created this slide. For me, this is one of the most comprehensive slides that actually lays out for you in most of EPI courses, what is the summary of the tests that are done depending on what is your outcome and exposure variable. So you can see here, depending if the outcome is categorical, continuous, or if the exposure is categorical or continuous. Therefore, the type of association test you use will vary on the type of your variable. Not only that, if you see here how when we have non-normal outcomes, how does the testing or the modeling varies. And so here's, if you did not do your univariate analysis, you would not know whether your outcome or exposure or both are non-normal, and therefore you will select the incorrect model or test estimate. Now, I'm not going to go all of that. I'll just give you two examples. One of the most common two tests used, the Pearson's chi-square and the two-sample t-test, and then we'll jump to the multivariate analysis. Okay, so the Pearson chi-square is the most common chi-square test. What does it do? It tests how comparable are the observed frequencies to the expected frequencies. So it's looking at observed versus expected, and how do they vary, or how are they more alike or different. And so what does it commonly examine? It examines the association between two categorical variables. So both the dependent and independent variable in this case are categorical. Just to give you an example, let's say you're looking at what is the association, or if there's an association between smoking and stroke. So smoking, yes, no, stroke, yes, no. So if we use here Pearson chi-square to examine the association, we'll say the null hypothesis is smoking is not associated with stroke, whereas the alternative hypothesis, smoking is associated with stroke. Now, this is I'm summarizing for here. If you use any statistical program software, you will have something similar to this. So you have almost a 2x2 in this case. You have the stroke, which is your, let's say, your dependent variable. So it's either yes or no, and then you have is the participant or patient smoker or not, and then yes or no. And you see here, if I can unfocus here, you can see that the p-value is, we're saying the p-value here is not significant in this case. So what does that mean? If the p-value is not significant, that is telling us that there is no statistically significant association between smoking and stroke. And so this is a step you have established, and therefore you're saying that there is no association, whether or not you're a smoker, with whether or not you have a stroke. Now, if I move on to a two-sample t-test, if you can see here, for the chi-square, you're saying both exposure and outcome, both dependent and independent variables are categorical. For a two-sample t-test, we're looking at, again, normal distribution. However, the exposure is two categories, and then we are looking at to examine the outcome is a continuous variable. So in this case, what are we testing? We're testing the association between a categorical exposure and a continuous outcome. What are we trying to compare? We are comparing the means of the continuous outcome among the different two categories of the exposure. And I'll give an example, hopefully that will help. Okay, so is there a difference in total cholesterol level among smokers and non-smokers? So just as a reminder, your cholesterol level is your outcome. It is the continuous variable. The smoking is your exposure, your independent variable, which is categorical, meaning yes, smoker, no, non-smoker. And so what we're assuming our null hypothesis here is that the mean of lipids among smokers and non-smokers is the same. There is no difference. However, our alternative hypothesis says, or we are saying here, is that the mean will be different among smokers and non-smokers. And so again, the output of a t-test will look like something like this. Are you a smoker? No, yes. And then we have, instead of having yes, no for cholesterol as the pi square test, we are looking at the mean. So you see here for non-smokers, the mean is 7.5. And for the smokers, the mean is 4.1. And so here the p-value is below 0.001, which means it's statistically significant. So in this case, what do we conclude? We reject our null hypothesis, and we're saying here is that the mean value of cholesterol is different between smokers and non-smokers. Okay, we are mid part of the class or the presentation, so hopefully you're still with me. We're moving to multivariate analysis. So as if you remember, we're saying this is the third step of the three-step univariate, bivariate, and multivariate. This is the more, let's say, advanced, complex part of your analyses that you start using models that account for all your variables you're including in that model. And then you're examining here for confounding and interaction. Okay, so in multivariate analysis, if I can just get you by this end of this presentation to kind of remember that one part of it is trying to figure out what is your best model based on the steps we already talked about. And then keeping in mind that no correct modeling technique excludes confounding interaction, meaning anytime you do an epi model, anytime you do an epi study, you always need to account for confounding and interaction. If you don't do that, whatever estimates you have will be biased and therefore not accurate, and you're just estimating what we call a crude association or a crude estimate, and not the most accurate estimate you are trying to achieve. This is another complex slide, but again, it's summarized for you when you're doing a model for a multivariate analysis, depending on the type of your outcome and exposure, which we're talking here, depending on your independent variable, which is your X, and your dependent variable, which is Y. You can see here, the type of models change or are different, and therefore not knowing what your variables are or what you're trying to model will not allow you to select the correct model. Now, I'm not going to go in all of these. I'll talk about two of these, which are the most common ones used, which is the multiple linear regression, and logistic regression. You can see one of them represents or is a model for a continuous Y, a continuous outcome. And then the logistic regression is used for dichotomous outcome. Okay, starting with multiple regression or multiple linear regression. Now, linear regression in general can be used to examine association between any two continuous variables, which means we can use this type of modeling while doing the bivariate analysis. And what it does is it tries to see what is the type, is there a linear relationship between the two variables you're trying to model. When we go into the more advanced type, which is called multiple linear regression, then not only are you looking at one exposure, but you're looking at more than one independent variable that might lead or is leading to an outcome, the dependent variable. So I'm just going to give you two examples of how a graph looks like to kind of hopefully help you understand what we talk about or what we're trying to achieve with linear regression. So with linear regression, these two images, the left and the right, are a perfect linear association. So if your data performs like this, that means you have a perfect linear association between your outcome and exposure, or your dependent and independent variable. The one on the left is a perfect positive correlation, which means when your exposure increases, the outcome increases. The one on the right is a perfect negative correlation. It's a perfect linear relationship, but it shows that when your exposure increases, your outcome decreases. So it's a negative effect or an opposite effect. You can see here there's still linearity. However, it's losing that kind of perfect line you see. And this is kind of a common way of looking at data. Here where it comes your standard deviation, how much are these different data points dispersing around your line? So if you imagine a line going here in the middle, and then you want to see how much does these dots how far apart are they from that line? So your standard deviation above and below, how wide is it? And so there is a linearity, however, it's lower. And so the data does not completely fit in a linear line. Now, if we had an image that the dots are all over the place, that means this is not a linear association, and therefore you cannot apply your multiple linear regression model. Okay, so just to give you an example here, let's say we're saying that linear regression both need to be, the outcome needs to be continuous. The independent or exposure can be both continuous and dichotomous. And just so you can imagine when we finish the univariate bivariate analysis, now let's say we're looking at what is the joint effect of smoking, age, blood pressure, and total cholesterol level. So if you can see here, I'm looking at 3 different variables: smoking, age, and blood pressure, and how do they affect the lipid level, the cholesterol level. And so it's important sometimes if you put the formula, it just kind of lets you imagine what you're trying to model here. So what I'm trying to say is there a way to, is there a strong association? Is there a linear association between how the lipid performs, increases or decreases, if I take into account all these variables, smoking, age, and blood pressure? And so we're assuming there's some sort of linear relationship that if we add these different variables, we can reach to the level of cholesterol or predict the level of cholesterol. Now, if this association of this model, if I model this using a statistical program and it's significant, what does that say? It says that there's an overall statistically significant association between what? Between the lipid, the cholesterol on your left, and all these 3 variables we have on the right. And that's key. This only says there's a strong, significant association between these 3 variables on your right and the total cholesterol level on the left. At least one of them, smoking, age, or blood pressure, is associated with cholesterol. And individual tests for each independent variable should be conducted. So what I'm trying to say here is unless you had your bivariate analysis that we spoke about earlier, and you know exactly what is the association between smoking and cholesterol, age and cholesterol, blood pressure and cholesterol, there is no way to understand exactly which one of these 3 is actually affecting the cholesterol level. And that's where we say, well, this is the final stage. And if you do not know what's going prior to it, it's difficult to understand how is your exposures, in this case, smoking, age, and blood pressure, affecting your outcome. Okay, so that's linear regression. Hopefully that was clear. Last part of the modeling that I'm going to talk about is logistic regression. Logistic regression is looking at a dichotomous Y. Disease, yes, no. Treatment, yes, no. And so this is your outcome you're looking at. Now, for logistic regression, it's the most common one used when we're looking at a dichotomous outcome. What does it assess? It assesses the association between a number of independent variables. What are the independent variables? So hopefully you haven't forgotten. They're your exposures. They're your X's. So it's the blood pressure. It is effective blood pressure. Let's say yes, no on stroke. Effective smoking, yes, no on stroke. And so that's your independent variable, and the probability of an outcome happening. So if I put this formula here and I say outcome odds ratio. So what is it? It is the odds of an outcome given an exposure over the odds of an outcome with no exposure. Okay, so it's kind of, you have your denominator and your numerator and your denominator, and it's trying to assess what's your odds of getting a certain outcome provided the presence or absence of an exposure. So let's look at an example. So if we're looking at if a patient goes to different healthcare providers for 4 weeks and what's the probability of recovering? Yes, no. So this is the outcome. You recovered, yes, you didn't recover, no, given the type of provider. Okay, so your exposure here is the type of provider. Let's say we're looking at an orthopedist, physical therapist, acupuncturist. And so these are different providers, but the outcome is the same. The outcome is either yes, you have recovered, no, you have not recovered. And we're taking into account, or we are adjusting for age, gender, and race. And so what the formula looks like, it looks like this: 1 on the top, and then your denominator includes, if you can see here, I'm accounting for my provider, which is my exposure in this case. And then the 3 different variables that I expect will also have effect. So I am adjusting for them because I think they're confounders. And I'll talk just a little bit about confounders, the slide after this. And I'm trying to see what is the probability of recovery given what type of provider you are visiting. So just to show you here, I'm talking about my exposure is a type of provider, and then the confounders are the 3 different variables we have added to the formula. And so what are we saying here? We're saying in the null hypothesis is that the odds ratio equals 1. So the division, if you remember the other slide, so your odds given the exposure divided by the odds with no exposure is the same, and that's why we get a 1. So let's say the odds 5/5 is 1. And so what we're saying here, there is no difference between the exposure affecting the outcome, and therefore our odds is 1. The alternative hypothesis in this case is that the odds did not equal 1, the division did not equal 1, and so I'm saying there is a statistical significance, there is a difference of odds, a difference of probability based on your exposure. Okay, hopefully that's clear. So again, that means I'm saying the odds of you recovering, let's say for going to an orthopedic, is twice as it is if you go to an acupuncturist. So you have higher odds, a higher probability of recovering, given that you went to an orthopedist compared to going to an acupuncturist. And that difference, saying that there's a higher probability going to one provider versus another, is your logistic regression modeling, is your odds. Okay, last 2 parts and then we're done. We talk about confounding and interaction. Maybe these are, if you're not really kind of into epi yet or in depth of it, these are maybe newer concepts to touch on. However, they are very relevant because if you don't take them into account, our estimates, whether you're talking about risk ratio, you're talking about incidence ratio, you're talking about a relative risk, if you don't account for these 2 different types of biases that may occur, then your outcome or your estimate is not accurate, it's biased. And so what are these? What do they mean? So if we look at confounding is defined as confusion or mixing of effects. Okay, so what are we saying here? We're saying that if I'm looking at a causal effect between an exposure and outcome, there's another variable that's affect our exposure and our outcome. So it's playing into how this causal relationship is going. Like you see here, so you have a covariate that affects your exposure and outcome, and I'll give you an example in the following slide. So the confounder is associated with exposure and it's associated with the outcome. So let's take blood pressure. Okay, so we have blood pressure here. What I'm trying to examine is what is the effect, okay, or does a higher BMI cause chronic heart disease? Okay, so in this case, we know that there's an association between higher BMI and CHD, chronic heart disease. However, blood pressure also affects BMI, or there is an association between blood pressure and BMI, meaning higher BMI does increase blood pressure. And we also know that blood pressure affects CHD. It's a risk factor for CHD. So in this case, the blood pressure is a confounder. What does that mean? If we do the modeling I was just talking about, without adjusting for blood pressure, you're not estimating the true effect of BMI on CHD, right? That means what you have here, if you get the estimate here, if you get the risk level here, it does not isolate, it does not adjust for BP. So it's a biased estimate, and therefore your model should adjust for blood pressure. What does adjust mean? It's trying to minimize the effect of blood pressure has on the BMI effect on the heart failure. So kind of isolating that effect to get a more accurate estimate of what does BMI or how does BMI cause CHD, coronary heart disease. Hopefully that was helpful. Now, the last part I'm going to talk about is interaction. Just 2 more slides. Interaction, even for epidemiologists, it's not the most fun part of the analyses. It's kind of a very confusing part. So don't be overwhelmed by it. That's normal. If you Google the definition of interaction, you'll see that even it's led by ambiguity. But before I go into that, I just want to touch on one more thing about confounding. So again, what we're saying here is that the effective exposure on the outcome is changed due to an existing association between other variables, as we showed, like BP, it's associated with BMI, but also is associated with CHD. Common ways to control confounding, which I'm sure you've been exposed to, but maybe not necessarily knew that they're done to minimize confounding, is one, randomization. So if you have a well-randomized trial, that minimizes the confounding effect in your sample. Matching also decreases the or controls for confounding. Stratification and restriction. So these are some of the methodology in the study planning that you can do that minimizes the effect of confounding. Again, part of it is that some of it is done during the planning of the study, which means during the collection part of the data, but other is done during the modeling part of the data. Okay, I think in the past 2 years, I think this applies well to public health professionals. It's like riding a bike, except the bike is on fire, you're on fire, and everything is on fire. I think a lot of us have been overwhelmed with the past 2 years, but hopefully the fire is put out soon. Finally, I'm just going to give 1 or 2 slides interaction. What is interaction? And try to give an example so you can also think about it once you start trying to conduct your study. Now, in statistics, the term interaction is used to refer departure from the underlying form of a statistical model, or it refers to the common situation in which a measure of effect changes over values of some other variables. And what does that mean? If you look at these 2 different graphs, on the left, you see there is a parallel line, 2 parallel lines between the exposed and unexposed, right? And so the risk difference here is constant. So if you subtract the risk difference between the exposed and unexposed, it will be constant throughout this association. Whereas you can see here, there is no longer a parallel association between the exposed and unexposed. So you see the exposed going upward more drastically or acutely compared to the unexposed. And this is essentially what we're trying to say about interaction. Because the relationship in the outcome between the exposed and unexposed looks like this, meaning age, in this case, is our modifier, meaning the way the exposure acts is different than the way the unexposed acts based on age. So in this instance, age is considered a modifier, and therefore it needs to be treated accordingly. What does that mean? That means when we do our modeling, there's different modeling techniques that are done to address for interaction. I'm not going to go through them now, but it just take into account that when you have that formulas I was showing you, there's going to be a 3rd segment of it, sometimes creating dummy variables, which are done to address interaction or EMM, effect measure modification. And the idea of that to kind of address or account for this departure, this inconsistency of the risk difference among the exposed and unexposed, and therefore reach to a more accurate estimate of the exposure and outcome, even in the presence of interaction. So I think that's my last slide. I just want to summarize here a few points. If you can take from this, the 2 slides I talked about, the first one is when you look at epi in general, what you're trying to study is a population, not a patient. You're collecting data. That data is not just a vertical or linear path of data. You're even collecting adjacent data. What I mean is you're looking at different other variables that may not be in a timely manner, so to speak. You're trying to test a hypothesis to assess an association in this population. And finally, you are doing it for a reason to see whether you're improving types of treatment, trying to implement interventions or preventions. And so that's the kind of the concept of what we're trying to do in EPI. And then the three parts of analyses when it comes to epidemiology always start with your univariate analysis, and then you go to your bivariate analysis, and then finally you reach your multivariate analysis, taking into mind the multivariate modeling that accounts for confounding and interaction. Finally, this is a very simple, easy to read book that I find very helpful when it comes to intro to EPI. I just thought to put it here for you as a reference. It kind of explains EPI in a very simplistic and realistic manner with examples. And these are some of the references I used for the presentation. And that is all. Thank you so much. Hopefully that was helpful and I have not bored you with all this EPI lingo. Thank you. Prof. Khalid.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Ada. Well, didn't bore me at all. I think you managed to really keep my full attention and really simplifying very important and basic concepts in this field. Thank you very much for a very thorough and simplification of many concepts. Please pose your question in the chat and the Q&A section. One question that comes to my mind is that when you do the multivariate analysis, the univariate and multivariate in terms of confounders, sometimes it is the same variable already available in the same patient. For example, if you have low income as one of the variables and low education, I mean, the educational level, the income level, and the medical insurance. For example, these are variables that we measured in one of our registries. And you can do univariate analysis, but once you start doing the multivariate analysis, these are probably the same kind of patients, or many of them are the same kind of patients that they are the ones who have low income, and they are the same ones who have low education and who are not medically covered. So how do you deal with that statistically?
Yes, so this is what we call collinearity. So if you have different variables which are essentially measuring the same thing, correct? So usually if they're low income, that means they cannot afford insurance. And if they're low income, usually that's because they're the low socio-demographic. And so in this case, you do not use all three variables within your model. Because that will bias your outcome and it will affect the way the exposure and outcome association. You try to stay away from collinearity, and you try to pick the variable that's most likely by literature that assesses or is able to estimate the three. So example, if you look at BMI is consistent of weight and height. You don't include weight and height and BMI in an equation. You change it into BMI, and that way you're targeting weight and height, and therefore you remove the collinearity from your model. And so thinking about that when you plan for your studies is avoiding these different estimates or these different variables that ask different questions that lead to some sort of a similar conclusion, because you cannot include all three in the model.
Yeah, you think that they are very related, not necessarily so, because you might have a patient with low income, yet he's working in a place where it can provide him or her with insurance. So it might not necessarily be mutually exclusive. So you think that they're very related, but not necessarily so. So this is the challenge.
Yeah, there's also there's a test that actually examine collinearity. So if you were saying I think low income, let's say, and insurance, if there's similarity but they're not completely collinear in your data, let's say in your data set, there's certain tests that can be done to examine how closely associated or correlated are they or not, and therefore accordingly you decide whether or not you can include them in your model.
Okay. I really liked your way of commenting on the once you have the univariate analysis, have a look at the data, examine them before proceeding further. What I usually tell my collaborators that don't be slave to the data. So don't just look at the data. And some people are just very focused on writing the manuscript. They just go and just write whatever it is significant without really putting what I call the clinician's hat. So really look at the tables and really think for yourself, does that really make sense? Anything that really looks odd, does not make sense, go back to you and discuss with your biostatistician and with your team and collaborators. Do you really believe these numbers? I mean, don't forget that numbers are numbers at the end, and particularly in databases or cohorts, the way we collect data makes a difference as well. Bias and sampling. Sometimes what we have that quote of garbage in, garbage out. So you basically, you can just get any kind of data that you want by manipulation or bias or what have you. But I have noticed this kind of knee-jerk reflex, if you want to call it, of people, particularly at the beginning of their careers, when they want to just go through academia and write papers and so on. They're really not writing the manuscript with the heart and soul of really trying to find the truth. They're just writing whatever any kind of program throw at them, and whatever the biostatistician email them, they just go and write whatever significant p-value, and that's it.
Yes. I think one of the main messages or lectures or whatever you call it, when I entered at the EPI program, is never look only at your p-value. That is extremely dangerous to just look at your p-value. Unless you look at the stepwise analyses of the data, that's very dangerous. As you said, I mean, whether it's garbage code, whether it's outliers, whether it's missing data, there's a whole science about how you deal with missing data. Is it missing at random? Is it not missing at random? Is the percentage of missing, above 5%, below 5%? And there's different ways of dealing with all of these. You come to the modeling part and you're basing all of it on incorrect assumptions, and therefore your outcome, your assumption or your conclusion is incorrect. And so I think data management is key in any study, small or big, because as you said, if it doesn't make sense and it's not thoroughly examined, it's just like dealing with a patient. If you don't examine each data point that you look at, if the tests are not making sense, then the treatment, the diagnosis is not going to make sense. And that same concept is applied to EPI.
Any last comments about the p-value? People really heavily criticize the p-value, that we're just basically, if the study becomes like 0.049, it's significant. And then if it becomes not like 0.051, where did this concept of p-value come in? And some studies use the double p-value, whatever you want to call it. So any comments?
So as you said, I think as a healthcare provider, as a decision maker, it's not just about how statistically significant it is how clinically significant it is. So there's two parts: statistical significance and clinical significance. And so if let's say we're saying that the association between the artery diameter and CHD is 0.001. So statistically, it is significant. But let's say when it comes to the probability of getting CHD, if it increases 0.01 in millimeter, the increase in probability of PhD is 0.000002. That's not clinically relevant. So there, and even if it's highly statistically significant, that does not translate into actual effective or something you can say. If I measure the artery today and I see an increase in it in this much, then I can say the probability or the odds or the risk of the patient developing CHD is critical. And so, what the data is saying is one thing, statistically, mathematically, what it says, opposed to how does it modify or change your treatment of a patient, or how does it change behavior, or how does it change policies that actually impact the population or the patient in a relevant manner. And also, I would just add, look at your standard deviation. If they're wide, and see how dispersed your data. That also gives you a sense of how your p-value is performing. And so I think, as you said, taking into context what other variables play role in changing your outcome, and how relevant it is to change decision making, whether it's clinically or whether it's more on a population based, are key to take into account when we look at statistical significance.
Great. We have almost 1 minute left. Any suggestions, Dr. Ada, for this platform to push, the agenda for research in the country and the region? Any thoughts, any recommendations for future talks from your point of view?
So I think, maybe Prof, you're more knowledgeable given your academic tenure. I think understanding where our students or junior faculty are weak at. I think that's key. We know there is shortage in general in epidemiology and biostatisticians. So in a sense, as a physician or a clinician, you need to be somewhat aware and understand basic epi. But understanding which parts of it is more difficult for our healthcare providers or researchers, I think it's key for us to be able to address those concerns. Whether it's basic statistical programs and translating this to easy use coding for them to use on their data, whether it's the concepts of modeling and how to select models based on your data, whether it's normal, non-normal, and missing. So I think it's just I think it would be interesting and relevant to know today where are the gaps in knowledge. When I did medicine, we didn't have much epi. We had one statistical course, so there is not much in it other than the very, very basic. And so I'm not sure. I know things have changed, but to what extent do they feel confident doing some, even if it's simple, but simple statistical analyses and good data mining in order to actually be able to conduct the research?
Fair enough. Well, there's no better time than the time that we live in, that we need epidemiologists around. Yeah. So been really hit by this pandemic, and hopefully it will reach an end soon. But it just highlights the extreme importance of this science, and how, if it is done and understood properly, how it can change the fate of generations and countries and human health. So thank you very much for highlighting these basic concepts. Has been really very nice and thorough, and I would like to thank you for accepting the invitation for your second talk in the Virtual Research Academy under the Saudi Heart Association, and looking forward to have you in the forum in the future.
Inshallah, بإذن Shukran, Prof. I appreciate the invite. I'm hoping إنه ما في أسئلة, إنه they understood what we're saying. Hopefully that's not that we lost their interest. But yeah, I think my last departing message would be, don't be overwhelmed. I think clinicians, healthcare providers, changing that hat to epi is not the easiest. I think that's what it's a common feeling. But once you get the basic concept, I think things feel much more clear and easier to comprehend. Thank you so much, Prof. It was a pleasure. With Tawfiq, inshallah, and I look forward to further collaboration. Allah يعطيك العافية إن شاء الله. Allah يعطيك العافية في أمان الله.